All right, got it?
Yes, you're recording the call. It says Youri. Oh, Youri is, yes. Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. Very happy with the guests that I have today on our All Things Canada edition. We are joined by a professor and a poet and a radio show host and a journalist and a peace activist and a racial justice activist, social justice activist. We are joined by Ms.Jones, and yeah, we're going to be talking all things Canada, and it's going to be a very special episode because it's Black History Month in North America, so I'm really looking forward to getting into it. So first of all, Ms.Jones, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
And so my first question I wanted to ask you, so the first question I wanted to ask you, Ms.Jones, is can you talk about the nationwide protest that happened in Canada, which was and it was a nationwide protest last summer as a response to the state murder of George Floyd. But what was very interesting about not just the protests that happened in Canada and New Zealand and France and Brazil and other places, you know, and in Britain as a as a response to the murder of George Floyd and showing solidarity to the Black Lives Matter there, but in each country where there was a black immigration population, or in Canada, which has a black population, many people use the opportunity to highlight institutional racism in Canada, which is very interesting because in Canada you have, yeah. So my first question is, can you talk about can you talk about that summer of Black Lives Matter protesting in Canada and highlighting institutional racism, anti-Black racism in Canada?
Yeah, I think we're about to go with that, is that Canada has an undeserved international reputation as some kind of haven of multiculturalism, and of course the place where escaped slaves were supposed to have gone to, right? So this is the Underground Railroad idea. And so many times when I'm traveling around the globe, particularly to Black countries, people are very surprised if you mention that there's racism in Canada, because people have very, very rosy vision. I think that's where you're about to go. So that is, of course, part of Canadian mythology, that because we are located beside the United States, we like to compare ourselves to the United States and always see ourselves as what Dr. Ronaldo Walcott calls the junior partner, right? That so it's always, we didn't have Jim Crow, we didn't have slavery, we don't have racism, we don't have mass incarceration, or if we do have these things, we certainly don't have them to the degree that the United States has them. In fact, there's something that our police love to quote and make, well, they've stopped now, but they used to say that we are experiencing the Ferguson effect, with the idea being that we look at what's happening in the States and then imagine that we're experiencing this in Canada, but the Black people are really just deluded. It's just that we want to be like the United States, so we start saying that police violence happens here because we see it happening in the United States. That was a narrative for a long time. But that is a very Canadian. The title of my book, if it ever comes out, is Canada is So Polite, right? I can do the poem for you at the end if you wish. So this idea of polite racism, yes, that we're not like that. We're not like that. It's not like that over here. That doesn't belong here. And of course, racism is ingrained in Canada. Obviously beginning with the genocide, ongoing and historic, of the Indigenous population. I live in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Jabuktuk in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral, unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Mi'kmaq people. And part of this history here is that Edward Cornwallis, who's the so-called founder of Halifax, actually creates a scalping law where he not only offers a bounty on the scalps of Mi'kmaq men, like the warriors, but also women and children. And in fact, the Mi'kmaq population in Nova Scotia drops to about 1,200 people at one point. And that's actually why residential schools, which is, of course, a government school system where Indigenous children were forcibly separated from their families. Those schools, of course, actively killed children. In some schools, 60 to 80% of children died in those schools. It was an assimilation project that was supposed to remove the Indian and put in the civilized person, right? So that started later in my province, not because of like good-heartedness, but because they really thought that the Mi'kmaq people would die out and that there wouldn't be a need for this. So of course we know that Canada is founded upon this land theft, genocide, residential schools, as I mentioned, the reserve system. And we know that South Africa, for example, when they were putting in the apartheid system, came to Canada to study our reserve system and re-imported that into South Africa. So we see, of course, how these colonial systems interact and then build upon each other. So again, in non-racist Canada, like we have this whole legacy. And then, of course, people may then say, okay, so we have this Indigenous legacy, but Blackness belongs to the United States. There's always an idea that, well, the specific Black issues belong to the American South and not to Canada. That is also untrue. Slavery, of course, existed in Canada. There's a book, The Hanging of Angelique, by Dr. Afua Cooper, that talks about a enslaved woman, Angelique, who was a Portuguese woman, also of Afro heritage, obviously, who burned down the city of Montreal and was executed for that. But at various points in the history of Montreal and that area, there was more enslaved people, including Indigenous people, at various points than settler Europeans, right? Slavery persisted longer in Canada than the end of slavery has been. We had slavery for more than 200 years, and we're just, 200 and 12 years, 2007 was the anniversary of 200 years of the abolition of the slave trade, right? So we're barely past that. So I say all that to say there's long histories of this. My province had segregated schools until the 1950s. You can go in the graveyards and see the separate section of the colored section where Black people were buried for many generations. The community of Africville, which was destroyed by the city in the 1960s, which was a settlement of Black people on the shores of the Bedford Basin that the city razed and destroyed, including bulldozing the church and then putting people in garbage trucks and putting this stuff and moving them out forcibly. So those same histories of forcible removal, which again match histories around the globe, such as in South Africa and the move into townships. So we have all those same histories. They are not separate here. The first race riots in North America took place in Shelburne, Birchtown, where the Black loyalists were burned out by the white loyalists over 10 days of rioting. So everywhere you look in Canada, there's just some examples. We have some of the strictest immigration rules in the world and a long history of racist immigration rules, right? Until the 1960s.
Wait, but now, I thought Australia was the one that was very, very strict about who can come in the country and who cannot come in the country. Because Canada is often, because again, Canada, this is...
We're actually about 200th in the world for taking in refugees. We were very proud of ourselves for taking in 25,000 Syrian refugees. And, you look at Germany, millions. So, but our immigration laws until the 1960s explicitly banned non-white immigrants. And there was some let in, in the 50s, they started letting in like teachers and nurses, and from the Caribbean in particular, and under incredibly racist circumstances, such as policing whether women had relationships, doing like pregnancy checks, like all kinds of sexuality checks on Black women that accompanied that. Wow. And it's not until the 1960s that we moved to the point system that even allows any kind of real substantial immigration by non-white people. And that was explicit policy. Robin Maynard writes about this in her book, Policing Black Lives, and how Canada quite literally is like, look at those racial problems in the States. We won't have them. We'll just be white. And so if you ever wonder why more Black people didn't enter Canada during the racial terror that was Jim Crow, the answer is because we didn't let them, and you do have some migration up from, like Oklahoma into Winnipeg or the prairies, for example, but certainly not on the scale you might expect, given that the history of segregation in the United States? And the answer is because we were blocking that. So we still have a heavily racialized police border. The majority of our deportations are Haitian people, Somali people, Nigerians, Jamaicans, right? A targeting of that. We have gang laws and gun laws that explicitly target Black men. We have Black over-incarceration in this country. Of course, massive Indigenous incarceration. 43% of our federal prisons are Indigenous women right now, the women's population. The youth population in jail is over 50% Indigenous. Child welfare is overwhelmingly Indigenous. But those numbers also fit with Black people as well. We have completely disproportionate children removed from family in the Black community, an ever-rising rate of incarceration, particularly of Black women. So on all of these measures, including police shootings, this is a long answer to get to this place, that of course, we have an accompanying history of and contemporary reality of police violence. So a recent report came out in Ontario, for example, that showed that the police kill Black people 20 times the rates of people of other races, and that's when you control for a weapon. In my province, we had what we call street checks, which is carting, or in other places, stop and frisk.
Yeah.
We had that in our province as well, and a report tabled about 2 years ago showed that Black people were 6 times more likely to be stopped by the police, Black men. And then the second group was Black women, who were checked more than white men, even though, of course, men commit more crimes than women, like it's also a gendered thing, right? So in that measure. Every measure and every report that ever looks at policing or looks at prisons or looks at state violence shows that Black people are on the receiving end of that. So to take us to this summer, we actually were protesting quite early because Regis Koczynski-Paquette she fell off her balcony under very suspicious circumstances when the police were called. So they were called on a wellness check for mental health. And a few minutes later, this young woman, Regis Koczynski-Paquette, of Indigenous Afro heritage, had fallen from the 20-something floor of this building and had died. And that was actually our first wave of protests. That when we went on the streets here in Halifax, she has roots in this province. So we protested at that time in relation to George Floyd, but specifically for Regis. And we did that the Saturday, and on the Monday, the Take a Knee protest started gathering steam. So I say this to say that this was certainly not dictated by or framed necessarily solely by, or even in relation to what was happening in the United States, because it was happening here. We rapidly also had a number of shooting of Indigenous people, often on wellness checks. So that history still continues to collide together between our two communities. So the idea that this is somehow foreign to Canada, that we are exempt, that we are importing this, the question of is Canada racist? This is kind of an endless loop you get caught in Canada. So this summer, every time you go on the news, but is Canada racist? And you're always back answering that question, right? And people arguing with that premise. So we never really get to the point where we even get to talk about what should be done or, how we should create policy, because we're still arguing about whether Canada is racist or not. So yeah, that's a bit of history of kind of the narratives that exist here. And this may be shocking to people because a lot of people have kind of been imbibing that because this is Canada's international reputation. We're the peacekeepers, we're the polite, kind people, we're this kind of paradise, we're all these things. But we're also a country
and even your fiscal conservatives, they may be fiscally conservatives, but they're socially liberal, and that you have all these people who believe in noblesse oblige, right?
Sorry, you just froze there, so I only heard even your fiscal conservatives, and then you froze.
Yeah, no, I was saying even your conservatives are progressives, like Brian Mulroney and stuff like that, and Stephen Harper. Yeah, he might be a fiscally conservative, but he's socially liberal. So there's always this image.
Liberal. No. Harper was extremely tough on crime. In fact, one of the things that when Trudeau came into power in 2015, Trudeau made a number of election promises to change Harper-era policies that he did not change. We just got a bill tabled, as you're calling, yesterday, a bill was tabled that's a so-called justice reform bill, but is wholly inadequate. But Harper actually was dreadful on justice and crime and punishment, and put in all kinds of unconstitutional minimums, even just really vindictive things like stripping programs out of prisons, no cake mix in the prison, it was just really, so no, actually Harper was quite socially conservative, and he was on the model of American style, because this is always our issue, right? Many people say the lines of culture run north to south in North America, not east to west. So, if you look in Alberta, it's on top of Texas, and you get a lot of the same kind of policies go through into Alberta, which of course tried to have the Reform Party at the time, and create this American style policy, right? Yeah. So again, a bit of a myth, right? That we have this international reputation. When Trump came in, there was an article in the New York Times saying that Trudeau was kind of the last hope for the liberal West, because we elected Trudeau. And then it was really funny because all these people were making racist comments underneath it. All these Canadians were yeah, Trudeau loves Muslim Sharia law. And I'm just proving that.
Oh my God, Jesus.
Things are you tired of hearing about residential schools? And then reports that 70% of people are tired of hearing from Indigenous people. These are the kind of things that take place in this country. We talk about we might be able to get clean water onto reserves by 2030. This is a place where the vast majority of Indigenous people living on reserves literally cannot access clean water, and their water is often being stolen and used in cities, but not being given to Indigenous people who are under boil water advisories, such as the Shoal Lake Reserve in Winnipeg, which has been giving water to Winnipeg for 80 years while they're under a boil water advisory themselves. That where there's no access to housing, you have people living in black mold. You have milk that's costing $5 up north or $10 because we don't have adequate. So these are things that exist in this country. People living in these conditions in one of the wealthiest countries in the world that has this reputation around the world as the kindest, nicest, most polite. We're not like that country. But the realities on here are very different. And of course, just because we don't do politics or history in the same way of the United States does not mean that it is not destructive to people's lives, and that, we are not, equally faced by state violence. It just often takes place in some different forms.
That's that's so incredible, because I mean, now even though I go out of my way to myth bust Canada and have voices like Eve Angler, Dimitri Lascaris, Barry Weisletter, Daniel Terade, your colleague Tamara Lorincz of of Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. I mean, it goes to show you that like Canada's propaganda system is so powerful that even I thought, well, Canada is at least better on immigration than Australia and England and and the U.S. But as you mentioned, no, it's not true. And this is coming from somebody who covers a lot Indigenous issues and knows about the plight of Indigenous people in the Five Eyes Alliance. But
issue is really interesting here because it is so hidden. So many people who are, a lot of people went out to protest Trump and the kids in cages and, family separation. In fact, Canada has indefinite immigration detention, had it longer than Trump. So that is policy in Canada. Indefinite immigration detention, meaning that you can be held forever in immigration detention. And there are people doing 8, 9, 10 years in immigration detention because of course, you can't get transport papers. So often if people like Somali, for example, if you can't get issued the travel papers, they simply hold you in jail. We have multiple unaccountable deaths in immigration custody that are literally not counted, and we don't have access to those names. We have no racial numbers on who is in immigration detention. And of course, when we talk about immigration detention, people often picture like a shelter, there's some special place. No, it's jail. If you are in immigration detention, you are in a provincial jail. You are literally being held in custody and you have committed no crime other than moving your body from one place to another. We separate kids in this country. There are 118 kids at least in immigration detention. So children that some of whom are also serving time without their parents, some of whom with their parents. So all of those policies exist in Canada.
Where are these immigrants coming from, actually?
So we got, until they recently just canceled, something we're pushing for a while was the cancellation of the Safe Third Party Country Agreement. So this is an idea that if somebody lands in a safe country, then you cannot claim refugee status elsewhere. So of course you had a lot of people in the States that wanted to come into Canada under Trump, like Muslim people, so people were coming up to the border, and there was those stories. And remember, they would be those stories of like, our border guards helping people across the border. And it was again like, look at Canada, But that was not really the reality. You often get people walking through into Canada across the border. There's a number of cases in Manitoba, which shares obviously a border through Minneapolis and like that part, like South Dakota, North Dakota, and people would walk up through often in the winter to come across the border. And there's all these cases of like Ghanaian people and stuff who have like got frostbite and lost their feet and hands as they wander around in chest deep snow. People in like the side of the border can often lock their barns and cars so that people can't get in and get warm, and people die doing this. And this is coming into Canada. I was part of a team that fought a case, quite famous case in Canada. Abdul Abdi, who was a Somali youth who was, so he never lived in Somalia. He was born in a refugee camp in Saudi Arabia. His parents died. He came to Canada with just his sister and 2 aunts, one of whom essentially identifies as his mother. The children were rapidly taken into foster care. This is in Nova Scotia, and made permanent wards of the state. They were not offered a translator to this day. The family doesn't really know why the children were taken into custody. They did not speak English at the time. So Abdul and his sister Fatuma, Fatuma's hijab was immediately stripped from her when she was taken into foster care, and she was never given another one. The children were locked up separately and separated in the initial homes they were in to prevent them from speaking Somali to each other because the workers feared they would plot to escape. And then they were put into extremely abusive living situations where they were left for years despite reporting abuse, and were returned over and over and over again.
And this is under who?
This is in my province, so like in Nova Scotia, like recently. So we fought this case in 2018.
Recently, so under this?
Yeah, so this would have been 1994 they came to Canada. So of course, right after Canada is in Somali taking part in, the Black Hawk Down business, right? Like Canada is very involved in Somalia. And in fact, and you can read Shireen Razik on this, it's called Dark Nights, I think. And it's about how Canada's peacekeeper tortured and were torturing youth and killing people while they're in Somalia. And that whole regiment had to be disbanded. And all these images came out of them raping youth. And they were like people, like black kids that would, come to get food in the compound, and they were raping them and like playing torturous games. And that was a big scandal in Canada. And we are, of course, actively involved in destabilizing Somalia, which is why there's so many Somali refugees that then come to Canada and completely abandoned, not given the resources, sort of trekked into housing. And now you have a generation of youth coming up that are now criminalized and written as gang members. And so Canada's compassionate and generosity, this is what's happening to these kids. So with Abdul and Fatuma coming in the 90s, yeah, they're taken into foster care. They did not get their citizenship. And in Canada, the policy is if you serve at least like 6 months in jail, not all at once, it can be non-concurrent, like it could be a month and then 2 months, you're eligible for deportation, which means they send you back if you have any kind of criminal offense. So because they did not get Abdul's citizenship, even though he had been in the country since age 6, even though he was bounced to 31 different foster homes in that time, between group homes, foster homes, he was severely abused in every single kind of way. And of course began committing crimes at an early age, like having involvement with the youth justice system, some of which were things like driving, he would borrow the family car to drive around the city and look for his sister, was like one of the police contacts. And when he turned 19, he committed an assault, and he was rapidly criminalized. Of course, he was placed into jail for this, what we call the crossover, which is the phenomenon of children in the child welfare system becoming criminalized and entering the justice system. There's a connection between that. Over half of kids in foster care end up in the prison system. This happened to Abdul, and because he did not have citizenship, they immediately began proceedings to deport him. So his sister Fatuma, who also does not have citizenship, stepped in to fight for him, and we fought that case, which raised a lot of these issues around Canada. Abdul only had a grade 6 education. How did that happen when you're in care of the state? Why was Abdul being bounced? Like, why are black kids so vulnerable to being criminalized? Why did the state not seek his citizenship when they would have known as a young black boy he was particularly vulnerable? And in fact, it turns out that you cannot get citizenship. They put a hold on you if you have, so the minute you have any kind of offense, they put a hold on you for like 5 years before you can seek citizenship, meaning that children at the age of 11 or 12, if you're being criminalized in the foster care system, you automatically are already ineligible for citizenship, which is, of course, also a violation of our obligations under the Convention of Rights of Children, right? So all of these issues are raised in this case. We actually successfully fought this deportation. Abdul is still in Canada. We were able to win that case. But I raise it just to say that that is the immigration system in Canada. We still have not been able to successfully fight that principle that children that come into foster care that do not have citizenship should have amnesty and be granted their citizenship and should not be eligible for deportation. But we have not been able to successfully fight that. In fact, there have been other cases subsequent that we've had to fight on the exact same principle. Kids that have been in foster care become criminalized and are now being deported. So that's just one of the many examples of state violence in Canada.
So then all that said, you talked about how the nationwide protests in Canada, yes, some of it was a response to George Floyd, but the Black Lives Matter movement in Canada, and the anti-colonial movement of Canada, led by Indigenous people, was already starting to protest against the state of affairs before George Floyd. So George Floyd was sort of the spark that led to Canada having to once again being confronted that, like, no, we're not the better version of the United States or the good cousin to Britain.
And remember, of course, it's Black Lives Matter Toronto that stops the Pride Parade and starts this Police Out of Pride movement. That happens in Toronto, right, in 2016. That's Black Lives Matter Toronto. So we already had an active Black Lives Matter movement. This was sort of a recharging this summer, but it certainly wasn't new. And of course, in my province, Nova Scotia, there has been a long history. I mean, you can go up into Sydney, Cape Breton, and see Manelec halls. People were very Garveyites because there was many people in the mines that were from the Caribbean. So they were in particular very much interested in Garvey, and that legacy is still very much visible around Lake Sydney, Glace Bay. With the destruction of Africville in the 60s, there was a lot of organizing by the Black community who realized, they were able to do this to us because we don't have political power. People like the great Rocky Jones. People should read his book, Burnley, Rocky Jones, Revolutionary, released post-mortem, but it's his the autobiography of Rocky and his life, known as Canada's Stokely Carmichael. He brought the Panthers to Canada in the 60s. So there was a Black Power movement in Halifax through the 1960s, for example. So Black Lives Matter isn't particularly new even to to the histories of organizing here. Dr. Ms.Jones, Rocky's sister, who is a really legendary trade unionist, reparations worker, Black feminist, who has been organizing for generations, like for decades. So there's always this tendency to also, and it's a Canadian tendency with all of us, right? The minute something happens in the States, people want to hashtag it. It's American imperialism, right? And that exists for Black culture too, that everyone sees what's happening in the States, then we want to copy it. So, the States, people are going to see, they're paying for kids to go to see Black Panther, we'll go see Black Panther, like that's always what we do, but we have our own histories of activism here. In fact, the reason why we never did a Black Lives Matter chapter in Halifax, even though we were doing this work for a long time, like I'm Mike Brown, was because we were like, why would we adopt rhetoric from the United States when we have a history here? So if you were going to do a movement, we should be doing Black United Front or something that already came from Halifax. And that's not to critique BLM. I just mean to say that we actually had a discussion, like in 2013, whether we should have a chapter, and we agreed that we were in a province with our own long history of organizing that we didn't want to.
In fact, it's funny that you say that because I follow a lot of because I follow a lot of the plight of Indigenous people, and in Australia, I mean the Indigenous population there, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders they're I mean I'm not an anthropologist, but from my observation and from the people I've talked to from Perth and places like that, their Indigenous culture is very similar to Indigenous culture in both Canada and the United States, and yet a lot of their protests, but they're called niggers, and they're called and a lot of the new form of the movement is called Black Lives Matter, and many of the people were even part of. They had their own Black Panther chapter, but I always kept thinking to myself, well, that's so weird because you guys have way more in common with the American Indian movement and the Red Power movement in Canada. So your reflections on that.
Yeah, and I mean, and of course our media only pays attention to stuff when it happens in the States. So the thing that happens, because of course these things, there's people protesting, but then the media reports, and then everyone wants to go to protest, so it like creates its own kind of narrative, right? So it's very normal here that the media can only understand things from an American lens at all as well. So we've, multiple protests, like we were doing defunding stuff before, it's just nobody cared. And then it happened in the States, and suddenly people realized and suddenly wanted to talk to abolitionists on the news, but it's not like this is new. Indigenous people may not have been using the term abolition, for example, but resurgence, people, I don't know more was a movement here, of course, and still is. So, these aren't really new movements to Canada. We have, again, long histories of Indigenous organizing, Black organizing, and of course, solidarities between us in terms of organizing together, which is, I think, a bit of a different landscape than the United States. That I'm not saying we're perfect practitioners of solidarity between our communities, but I think there's perhaps more discourse in Canada around the importance of that solidarity and what that looks like than perhaps in the United States, in my experience. But yeah.
Actually, before I ask you about the history and who are Canada's answers to Black Panther leaders or Dr. Cornel West and so forth, I actually did want to talk to you because that's sort of related to question one, is what I really thought was very inspirational and what I really loved about the protests that happened in Canada was you had the Black Lives Matter merging with the Idle No More and the Native Lives Matter, and I just thought that was so inspirational. And as a guy who gets very depressed at the state of affairs in Canada and the discourse that happens in Canada, that was the one thing where I thought, oh my gosh, I'm really optimistic about this development, which was seeing Black Lives Matter merging with Native Lives Matter and that sort of solidarity. Bridging and that coalition building, because like you said, that's not there in the United States. I mean, I love the Black civil rights leaders of the United States, but I don't see that kind of coalition building between the anti-colonial struggle of Native Americans and the Black civil rights movement. But that is happening in Canada, and I wanted your your reflections on that, because I've seen you on programs with Pamela Palmater and so forth.
Course. And I mean, it's difficult difficult here because, of course, we're always fed by divide and rule and state tensions. And what tends to happen is institutionally there's a sort of prioritization. So with reconciliation, of course, many institutions have picked that up in the same shallow way that Black Lives Matter was picked up in statements. And, they want to do an Indigenous hire, or, of course, we know that it just means now we'll all smudge before meetings, and like we're not going to address anything else, right? And so these things sort of perpetually create tensions because they'll, be like, we have a diversity position for Black or Indigenous person. You're like, okay, but like, so we're constantly being placed against each other in a kind of scarcity narrative, which can make that kind of organizing difficult. But I think there is growing awareness, and has been historic awareness, that yes, we need to be in solidarity. I mean, we carry signs that say things like no justice on stolen land, which is a recognition that how are we going to fundamentally address justice while we live on territories that are still now being extracted, exploited Indigenous people. We know Indigenous sovereignty is the #1 challenge to capitalism in this country. What are people being criminalized for? Standing in the way of pipelines, right? And sovereignty means that, of course, the government is supposed to ask for meaningful consent, and this is what can hold up things like condo developments and pipelines and mines, and it's Indigenous people on the land putting their bodies on the land in the way of capitalism. And that is why you see, grandmothers being arrested at Wet'suwet'en, or Mohawk people being arrested in Six Nations repeatedly because a golf course or a development is going up. So that is anti-capitalist as well as anti-colonial activity. And of course, we understand as abolitionists, for example, that abolition is also rethinking capitalism, move away from capitalism. We can't abolish under capitalism. And it's, of course, Indigenous sovereignty that is one of the biggest challenges to the nation state as it wants to constitute itself. And of course, the genocide of Indigenous people is inherently related to the extraction of resources, the theft of land, and the ongoing, as always, they move people onto a reserve and then discover oil on your reserve, and now they want that place they moved you to as well, right? So just fundamentally, logically, before we even get into ethical issues, how can we address any of these issues if we're not in solidarity with and working with Indigenous people? And then, of course, beyond that, of course, we don't have the same history. Like we can't say, oh, it's all the same. We have very different histories. We were enslaved. Obviously, residential schools, like there's things that we can sort of parallel, but obviously
immigration and the fact that immigrants, I mean, even the ones that are considered to have come in legally, a lot of them get assimilated into the system, and then then that's perpetuates this sort of socioeconomic racial caste system in which an immigrant has much more rights than an Indigenous person.
And also, of course, they don't, the citizenship manual has very little on Indigenous people, and whatever little they have was recently added. So you're not required, when you come to Canada as an immigrant, to take the citizenship test. You're certainly not required to know anything about Indigenous people, Indigenous histories. And often, of course, living in a white supremacist society, people move here and you're fed racist narratives, right? We don't go downtown, you don't go to these places, or, and often, yes, you can get a narrative where immigrants will adopt the good immigrant narrative around, I worked hard, why can't they?
Yeah.
Being on the government or whatever. They've been here so long. I come from war-torn country, and these people are so, you'll get, and these are, of course, divide and rule narratives. They exist in all our communities. Anti-Blackness exists for Indigenous people. Anti-Indigeneity exists for Black people, because these are state narratives. So it's hard work, right? And then there's always this feeling of, why are they getting this? Like, why are they getting this one? Why are they getting this? Which is, of course, just the state handing out crumbs. So we have to do a lot of serious work together. And I think the other thing is, that we always think of things in terms of whiteness, right? So Black people think of ourselves in relation to white people. Indigenous people are taught to think of themselves in relation to white people. And there's not an idea that there's a separate conversation that Black and Indigenous people need to be having by ourselves that has nothing to do with white people, right? But so much of everything is also conditioned through white supremacy. So that's difficult. It's difficult. I don't want to suggest we're some paradise of organizing, but I think it is encouraging that I think most people recognize, particularly people in abolition movements, or defunding movements or justice movements, really recognize that this work has to be done and it's necessary. And there's been some really, like during Abdul, which I mentioned, the Mi'kmaq community was like, we'll give him citizenship. With Africville, Mi'kmaq elders have said, we grant you the land. So we've had all these moments where Mi'kmaq people have used their sovereignty to say, like, this is what justice is. Like under Mi'kmaq law, like, we can accept who we want as citizens. We decide who belongs. We have a notion of kinship. We have a notion of territory that's very powerful. So, here we have the Alton Gas movement, the grassroots grandmothers who have been out defending the river and the water. Of course, Mi'kmaq fisheries, people may be familiar with, where they started a sustainable fishery and were like literally terrorized by white people, including with the RCMP allowing this and often colluding with it, like burning down like where they were storing lobster, like attacking their boats, peeing on their stuff, like putting up things to slash their tires. They went through an incredible amount of terrorist violence this fall, simply for trying to create a sustainable livelihood fishery, which is like theirs by law and by treaty. So Canada always wants to follow the law until it involves following the promises made in treaties, which again are made with the Crown. So in Nova Scotia, we are governed by the 1752 peace and friendship treaties made with the British Crown, and those have not been repealed. They are active, but we never want to follow them, right? And Pam Palmer, of course, talks a lot about this, the treaty relationship between Indigenous people and the nation. So like these are all just things. So yeah, I mean it's a difficult road, but I think it's really important. That Black people and of course, it's Black Indigenous people. Those are not separate solid. Like there are people of both heritages, and of course, historically, a lot of African Nova Scotians have some kind of Mi'kmaq blood because, like, who do you think was sheltering people? Similarly, when Indigenous kids were being taken to residential schools, it was frequently the Black community that would hide them. So you have some people that would be listed as Black but are actually Mi'kmaq, and vice versa, right? So there's a lot of interaction between our communities. So.
It's incredible, and I just hope that more of that solidarity keeps building. And before I get to then some of these specific historical questions, is why do you and I asked this question to Robert and Selena Aggington of the Dunbar Song Aboriginal Corporation in Perth. Why do you think there's more international solidarity towards the plight of Black Americans, or what happened in or racial apartheid in South Africa, but not so much global protests and campaigns against the plight of Indigenous people, like in Australia, where the Aboriginal people are the most incarcerated on the planet, or the Sami people, or what's happening in Canada, even though there's this interesting development of the black civil rights movement in Canada, building solidarity with the Indigenous people, because it's interesting how in Canada the plight of Indigenous people is a topic which the corporate media can't ignore, which the CBC can't ignore, in which it's even a focal point that has to be talked about in prime minister debates.
Well, I mean, some of that is obviously the history of civil rights. So again, the States has, a kind of access to the world TVs that obviously people in Canada or in other countries don't have. We're right next to them, and we get all their media constantly. Like we have to, and we don't have very good protections on Canadian media either, other than CBC, right? So most of what we consume is American media. So do
you think it's a way to distract Canadians, Kiwis, and Aussies, and even French people from their own backyard racism?
My experience of Europeans is they're always like, "Don't bring that American stuff here. We don't have racism." Like, you realize you colonized the planet, right? So I mean, Britain has not come to terms with their colonial history. I mean, the idea that the Queen can just freely walk around unaccosted is amazing. That Queen in her lifetime colonized my mother. Like, this is not ancient history. My mother grew up in a colonized country that sought independence in her lifetime. My grandfather was charged with sedition for singing calypso songs against, like, this queen's family, Like,
which country? Jamaica or
in Trinidad.
Trinidad. Okay.
You know what I mean? So this is not ancient history. Like, these are in our own families that we grew up under, like our parents grew up under colonial rule, yet we're supposed to somehow pretend this is ancient history. I mean, they're the ones that bragged about the pink bits, right? Like, if you remember that movie, Hope and Glory or whatever, where they're like, we are the pink bits, and it's like, and of course, the sun never sets on the British Empire and all of this. You can literally spin a globe, put your finger down, and you will hit a site where the British committed some kind of massacre, including the oceans and the slave trade, but there's so I mean, one is that England simply has not, and Britain has simply not come to terms with that history of the slave trade, with the history of colonization, with their histories of massacres, and they're in complete denial about it, just as Canada's in denial about Indigenous genocide. It's very common if it's, a fundamental, it's like the gap that you can't actually come to terms with, because then you could not believe that you were a good, welcoming, civilized, such and such world-leading developed country, right? So our countries can never come to terms with this, because to do so would remove the whole edifice. So I think, first of all, that's a huge question, that there's a lot of lies, and the British are now seen as the sort of bumbling but lovable, people are not the vicious colonizers that they were, that, you know, massacred people in Kenya, massacred us everywhere around the world, you know, so that's one.
Well, in fact, you have this problem in Canada with what Steve Engler calls the left nationalists, the people who think that Canada is a colony of America. In the Brexit debates, a lot of what was called the Lexiteers, the people on the left who supported leaving the European Union, a lot of them would make arguments that they were being colonized by the European Union. And okay, you can make that argument when it comes to like Eastern Europe, when it comes to like Greece, Spain, and Portugal, but Britain colonized by the European Union, well, yeah. No.
Yeah. And I mean, so yeah, there's that. And I want to be careful when I even say Britain here, because I'm sure there's Irish and Scottish people out here that will be mad. I mean, my father's Welsh, so, you know, they have their own anti-colonial history, of course, and their own system of being, like, you know, for example, placed into schools where Welsh was forced out of them, etc. Right? So again, colonization repeats itself. These are successful strategies. I think part of it, and those of us who are in like former British colonies, Commonwealth countries, like that absence, I think, partially repeats itself. And then, of course, yeah, the civil rights movement has taken on a kind of legendary status, which is based on a lot of inaccurate histories as well, obviously.
Yep.
That we're being subjected to right now in Black History Month. Rosa Parks just got tired. Martin Luther King, let alone, you know, like all of these kind of false narratives that become these mythologies that get promoted. So I think there's a lot of reasons. So again, it has to do with, I think, a particular power of the United States to control narrative. Through controlling so much entertainment, so much media, so much that we consume. And then it allows other countries to project that onto the United States and say this doesn't happen here. And yeah, very similar. Yeah. Europeans are always arguing this online, like, you're bringing race to us. Like, the people are very fierce when there's like protests in England and stuff, right? Like, this is American.
Oh my God, yeah, tell me about it, yeah.
You know, like when you try to not have like Svartfjord or whatever, you know, and like, this is our history. How dare you bring this American politics? Black face is our culture, you know, and like Black people like, yeah, we're over here like being here, not liking this, and we're not Americans, you know. So right now you very much have this kind of very successful discourse that this is woke politics created by the United States, and you're only a fool if you adopt it because it has nothing to do with you. And this, of course, has allowed so many countries to erase their own histories of colonization, of racism. You know, so you're in Belgium, I'm sure you obviously know King Leopold, you know, like, but like things that just are not, I'm sure people are still in denial about that, right?
Oh, and yeah, definitely. And in fact, anything, you know, anything that happens in the Congo, whether it was how Mobutu got into power or the mess that, you know, that we're in now with Kabila and Rwanda, that's just because us Africans just don't know how to get along with each other. It's all the tribalism. Nothing to do with the fact that, like, no, it's ongoing Belgian imperialism, French imperialism, British imperialism. In fact, the European Union, one thing which I'm always skeptical about pan-Europeanism or pan-Westernism is they all get together to do crimes against humanity in Haiti, in Rwanda, in Congo, in Uganda, and, you know, South Africa. So.
And then this is, I mean, I'm sure Zen could probably talk about this too, but anti-war discourse, anti-imperial discourse is so weak on the left. We don't have a single party. So, you know, the NDP, which is our supposed leftist party, supports things like purchasing military weapons. And you can if you go through our entire election cycle, there was not one debate on military policy. It's never mentioned. It's not on the platform. Nobody talks about it. So Canada is in complete denial of ourselves as an imperial nation, although, of course, as people have probably heard in previous discussions of, we're instrumental in the coup on Haiti. We're a member of the Lima group that is instrumental in like Venezuela, Bolivia. You know, we are part of all of these things.
Which is a war on Black and Indigenous people, you know? And the efforts to overturn Hugo Chavez's reforms and get rid of Maduro.
So yeah, so I mean, but that is not even a common topic of leftist discourse, right? One of the things I always kind of make fun of, critique in Black History Month, or African Heritage Month, as we call it here, is, you know, everyone like has the kente for Africa, but nobody talks about what it means to be in political assault. So we don't use Black History Month to protest like Canadian military exercises with AFRICOM, you know, like on the African continent, while we're violating the sovereignty of African nations, but we want to drum and wear kente and say we're all African, right? Which is a deliberate move. Like that, actually, that whole Afrocentric movement was about creating a superficial cultural idea for the elites and removing us from like real political solidarity on the left with Africa, right? That's always been the case. And that's a deliberate move off, you know, after like again, the CIA is out in the Congo executing, like all this is like, these things are so deep, right? So then the Black middle class is sold through ideas like roots and stuff, this idea of return to Africa, but in this very bourgeois way that doesn't involve actually talking about reparations or talking about what is being thieved from the continent, or talking about, yes, how are those of us who live in these countries now collude with and benefit from Canada's imperialism. Our mining companies in Canada, of course, some of the most vicious on earth. We have a long record in this country, and nobody talks about this in Canada other than like mining people and environmental activists. That is not a huge part of public discourse, because again, we just have no awareness of foreign policy and our kind of actions. So I think that.
But then this leads to I'm surprised I didn't even write this as a question, but I have to ask this then, is given all of this, given all this, like, is this not taught in schools at all?
Oh
the anti-black racism, Canada's slavery, Canada's segregation policies, is this not taught like at all in schools?
I mean, for me, not at all, but I'm a little older. Now the kids, like, they have to learn about residential schools. That's new since the reconciliation. But I mean, like, what you learn, your likelihood to have a Mi'kmaq teacher, so like, you're not going to have a Mi'kmaq teacher probably. You're going to have a white teacher reading about it. So many of the kids find it traumatic, right? A lot of the kids are like, I'm sitting through learning about this, and it's like they're coming home crying and their parents have to talk to the school, so it's being taught wrong. So it's not necessarily a good thing, but they are supposed to be teaching like reconciliation, residential schools, Indigenous history, at each level. But yeah, how that takes place. And of course, we can imagine what kind of watered down history that is, who's teaching that. And it's a periodic source of resentment. Some education schools and stuff will try to make mandatory courses on Indigenous studies, and the white students always complain and lodge legal things. We're being brainwashed, like there's that kind of history. People are very resentful, and there's also pushback on the indigenization of the university, and that means they don't have to have qualifications, and they're like all of that.
Is that because, and that defensiveness, that disgusting defensiveness of of white Canada, is that just because Canadians are they just like to keep telling themselves, we're not like America, we're not a cousin, we were not part of the British Empire, Is it just like one of those things where, like, it's kind of like what Lenny Bruce said, like, if white America told the truth for one day, its whole world would fall apart? Is that sort of like what it is when it comes to Indigenous people and Black history in Canada?
It's passive-aggressive Canadian culture as well. Like, we inherit that kind of waspy, like upper Canadian, like Toronto culture is like that very waspy culture, right? So to a certain extent, like, I think Canadians sort of think Americans are vulgar, right? Like, there's a lot of like, oh, Americans, like this idea, oh, they have velvet Elvises, and like the sort of Canadian thing is we like hate Americans, and we all, like, people don't know this because people think Canadians and Americans must be tight. In reality, like, Canada's biggest hatred, like, Canadians hate Americans, right? Like, we have items, like the popular item we used to have was talking to Americans, where like, this hour 22 minutes used to go and like tell Americans that like the Prime Minister of Canada was called poutine, and then we'd all laugh that Americans actually thought that because they're so stupid, right? Like, that's very Canadian, right? Like, that is like
Jesus Christ.
Maggie's coat of hair, which is like this, we're not supposed to go on the rocks, and like every year an American falls in the ocean, and everyone's like, that's Americans for you, So that's like very Canadian. And I say that to be like, Canada has a very sort of stiff upper lip waspy kind of culture as well. So it's simply considered vulgar to talk about these things in public as well. Arguing is somehow uncivilized. Raising your voice. I say this in my poem. It's rude to raise your voice in Canada. Like that.
Yeah. I remember.
White culture when it comes to that, right? So there's also this idea that you're being un-Canadian. That's not how we are. You're out of line. Like this kind of Canadian civility, which is all about smiling in people's faces and doing your dirt behind closed doors. Like, that is extremely Canadian. I once called it the violence of the paperwork, and I suggested that Canada's a lot of violence quietly through like signing papers and stuff. Like, we don't necessarily put it in the open. So yeah, we have a particular flavor of violence that is never openly admitted to. Like, and then we believe like, we didn't have the KKK here or something. And, so this idea that like America is so overt with it, right? Like it's just like, yeah, let's all have guns, and then we get to say, well, we're not like that. But we do violence in these very, very passive aggressive ways as well. We have active violence as well, but it's also, yeah, like people aren't necessarily going to come to you and say, this is why we're not hiring you, or it's just done, and everyone knows. So yeah, I think it's partly Canadian culture. It's considered very un-Canadian to argue, to critique, to dare to have a political opinion and place it on the table. Those things are all out of pocket here. And of course, yeah. So
Then the history of anti-black racism, I mean, you already alluded to quite a lot, slavery, your own versions of Jim Crows, and the horrible statistics that plague Black Canadians being overrepresented in jail along with their Indigenous brothers and sisters. And so then I have to ask then is which period was all of this pushed back against, and who were some of the Black Canadian versions of an MLK Jr., a Malcolm X, or Black Panthers, and yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, even when I said the first recorded North American race riots in Birchtown, those begin because David George is preaching to white people. So, of course, Shelburne Birchtown is settled by loyalists. So these are people fleeing the War of 1776. So people who wanted to stay loyal to the crown, like white people, often coming up with enslaved people, like with their slaves, and Black people who dealt with the crown for freedom. So if you fought for the British...
After the Revolutionary War.
Promised if you fought in the war, Black people were promised land, which, of course, then they didn't get. But they were promised... Under the Brown Spriggs land grants, they were promised like sort of the equivalent of 100 acres and a mule, right? Like if you fight, and it wasn't about the British loving Black people, it was about depriving slave owners of their property as a military strategy, right? So they said to the Black people, come over to our lines. So someone like David George would have, come up from America and was preaching, and of course was burned out of town, right? Because the white settlers rebelled against this. Richard Preston is a very famous figure in my province who has escaped, particularly around the War of 1812, where we get another wave of refugees. The short story is his mother had escaped to Canada before. He comes up to find her to Nova Scotia. He does find her and believes that's a holy miracle, takes the name of Preston in the name of the Black settlement, and then welds together our province. By creating the African United Baptist Association to create a way for Black people to have a political organ. I mentioned, so that throughout history, what I want to say is often in unrecorded ways, we have a history of resistance. The Maroons were here. So the Maroons, when they're kicked out of Jamaica, the British makes a deal to bring them to Nova Scotia. They only briefly stay here, and then most of them go back to Sierra Leone. They basically bargain their way back to Sierra Leone. Why am I blanking on his name? Oh my gosh, this is gross. I wrote a whole poem about him. And I'm blanking on his name now. The 15 ships guy. There's a very I don't know why I'm blanking on his name. That's terrible. I'm sorry.
No worries.
But there's a guy whose name I'm blanking on that goes to London to bargain for the loyalists to be able to go to Sierra Leone as well. We actually end up as colonizers. That's the sad thing about history here, is that a lot of the Black people leave Nova Scotia and end up colonizing Sierra Leone and becoming the ruling class in Sierra Leone. Like a lot of those, that's the connection, right? But he went actually to England and petitioned the crown that the loyalists could leave and go back to Africa, and they do. So we have this kind of history as well. But if we're getting into more recent history, Rocky Jones, I mentioned, very, very important civil rights figure. We now have Viola Desmond on the money. So now that's the only Black woman we're allowed to know about, and partially because she's Canada's Rosa Parks. So you see how we can't have a history without it being influenced by the United States. But of course, who was sat in the wrong place in a movie theater and was forcibly arrested and removed and fought that case. Oh my gosh! Was
it more of a quiet struggle? And when I mean quiet struggle, it wasn't as heavily recorded the history of the Black civil rights movement in Canada as opposed to
the mass kind of movement. But we definitely had, you can look at, I mentioned the many Black nurses that came into Canada. A lot of those women were involved in various court cases and political organizing. In fact, one of a woman here, Francois Baylis, who's a philosopher and ethicist, her mother was in a very famous case because she was very light-skinned. She was Barbadian, but she was denied a nursing job in Montreal. So she went with her white friend for an application, and they told her the job is filled and then gave the job to her white friend. So she knew that wasn't the case. So she challenged it in court, and very famously, they sort of said, well, we don't know if you're Black or not. And she said, yes, I am a Negro, right? So we have these kind of things. So often in the court records that have been quite buried, you will find people that were making legal challenges. people that were challenging like the laws that were, sexually checking like Black women, policing and deporting Black women for having like a relationship or whatever. So it was in that sense quieter. But I mean, there was a full movement here, like through the 60s. Certainly in response to Africa, people were talking about, you can see that in Rocky's book, like they were like marching to the police station, but no, not in the same kind of mass way. But yeah, I mean, like those histories take place all over Canada. But of course, we don't really get numbers as such until immigration opens up. So it's, like Nova Scotia is here, and there's obviously a long history here, and the oldest Black presence in North America is Matthew de Costa in 1603 coming to Nova Scotia, right? But we have 7, 8, 10 generations of people that are African Nova Scotians that have been here forever. But of course, Toronto, etc., that really only is the 1960s. So there's a relatively young history because we don't allow immigration. It's only, of course, in the 60s past where we start getting more of a Black population. So we didn't necessarily, like in the 1965, what would the numbers have looked like in Canada? We didn't have a mass number to start with, right? So that would be part of the challenge.
And Eve, I think, I hope I'm not misquoting him, so apologies in advance, Eve. But I think when I did a special episode with him where we talked about all things Quebec, I think Eve told me that Montreal tends to be quite the international biracial place, but when you go to Quebec City and other parts of Quebec, it tends to be very predominantly white. Well, and is that because of that very strict immigration policy, which has always actually been on the books in Canada? And of course, Quebec is, of course, is a whole interesting province in and of itself because it's French speaking. It was discriminated by the British, but now they tend to also use their victimhood to discriminate against non-white European Quebecers.
Yeah, they'll always claim that pure laine is not a racist thing because, like, if you're a true Quebecer, you're pure laine, like pure wool, right? And they'll always claim that that's not any kind of racist thing. But obviously, anytime you have any kind of purity narrative, we know what that's about. But Montreal, in particular, McGill, a lot of people came into McGill to study. That's one reason. And, of course, the very famous Sir George Williams stuff. So that's, of course, now Concordia, but used to be called Sir George Williams. And there's the very famous rebellion uprising for George Williams, where the Caribbean students, including Maurice, like Bishop, who will go back to, of course, he gets deported from Canada because of that and goes on to like lead Jamaica and of course leads into the Grenadian Revolution, right? So
and then gets overthrown in a Canadian American British backed coup.
So a lot of the people that end up in leading that revolution were students in Sir George Williams, were involved in that. Wow. So there's like very much that connection. If you say to people in the Caribbean like Concordia, they will always be like, that was Sir George Williams, because like people walked out in the Caribbean all over that. It was a lot of solidarity protests because it begins with Black students getting lower grades on assignments and of course breaking into the computers or whatever to get the student numbers to submit their papers with white student numbers to prove that they're being downgraded and then occupying the computer lab, right? So there was mass walkouts and political action across the Caribbean in solidarity with these students. And that, of course, is taking place in Canada, right? So I hope I'm right about Bishop being involved. If it wasn't him anyway, it was many of the people that become leaders in the Grenadian Revolution. They like kicked out of Canada, right? Like they're all criminalized and then deported. So yeah, I mean, like so that's part of the movement going on here, and that's of course in the 60s, right?
So let's talk about then. And of course, this goes back to the first question, which is institutional racism in Canada and police brutality. Now, of course, I'm of the opinion that evil did not start under Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau. That's both of the major parties.
Justin Trudeau.
yeah, exactly. The Liberals, the Progressive Conservatives, then the Conservatives, and even the NDP all seem to, they all engage in anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, and of course imperialism. But when did the period of you mentioned Robin Maynard. I really want to get her book because both she and Pamela Pomander have talked about the history of mass incarceration and the racist policing in Canada. But when did that period actually start in Canada, and where does the drug war and the other classist stuff play into all of that?
So a lot of the history of policing in Canada, so first of all, border policing, right, in order to police Black people from coming into Canada. And also, of course, anxieties about immigration. So, I mean, for example, you have Sikh people coming into BC to work in the lumber industry, and then that's cut off, right? Of course, very famously, the Chinese coming in to build the railroad, and then the deliberate Chinese Exclusion Act. So, like, not letting them bring their families, making sure that Chinese people couldn't settle, right? So, like, that's part of the history, and that's of course accompanied by policing, right? Like border policing. Of course, the RCMP are a border police, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. They evolved to their frontier police, right? So in other words, pushing north and pushing west, so into Indigenous lands. So they're inherently connected to this settler expansion. The RCMP are responsible for returning kids to school, residential schools, when they run away, right? Wow. So the whole RCMP always get their man stuff is in the context of colonial violence, of settler violence, of raising Indigenous people off the land and pushing them onto reserve, and then making sure that, so the pass system exists for Indigenous people, much like South Africa, right? That's what it's based on, right? And then you have to show papers to leave the reserve, like, and consolidating and centralizing people. So that's what a lot of our earlier history of policing emerges from. So first of all, yeah, the genocide and policing of Indigenous people, and then particularly when you start getting immigration through the 16th centuries, of course, then directed towards Black communities, and then of course the notion of like Somalis needing to be policed, Nigerians needing to be policed. So it's embedded in particularly in anti-Indigenous history, but then of course the policing of the border to ensure the absence of Blackness as well, right? So those are some of the roots. When did it evolve? I mean, like it's always been there, because the roots of policing are around they often call themselves the thin blue line, right? This idea that they're the only thing that stands between civilization and chaos. So who is considered to be inside that civilization? The white settler. And who is outside of it? Indigenous people, literally conceived as like the forest, the dark, the untamed wilderness. Black people, people with disabilities, queer people, trans people, people who are homeless, people who are drug users, people who are homeless. That is all outside the idea of the public. In Canada, we have a minister of public safety, and that is not somebody who make sure there's railings so that, you don't fall over into the road. That is guns, drugs, and the border. So our idea of safety is inherently around deporting Black people, policing gun laws that are like towards Black people, policing Indigenous people, and then deciding who's the public, which is always imagined as inherently white, right? That the public is white and middle class, and their property and lives need to be protected, and they're threatened by all of us. And that's what policing is directed towards. So policing is always about who needs to be disciplined, controlled, and contained. And that will always be Black and Indigenous people. So you will see the same mechanism here. So in a place like Nova Scotia, where there is like a long history of Black people, there's 48 Black communities, but like that is often just a piece of a road, or like, the hill or something, usually located beside an environmental disaster, like beside some kind of dump or landfill, or the runoff from the steel plant or whatever, will be right beside our communities. And like it was literally like in Halifax, that it's like close enough to be able to walk in to be a maid or a construction worker, but not close enough that we have to live with you, right? Yeah. So these a lot of like rural communities, and that's a policy of containment as well, where we're allowed to rent, where we were allowed to settle. So we can't.
Oh yeah, and of course it goes from white Canada saying Black people cannot buy a home here. But of course, you can't do that anymore once, the 60s comes and civil rights and the charters of freedom were introduced. So, okay, how can we exclude them? Mass incarceration, the drug wars and stuff like that, or just plain Dickensian policies, right?
They pretty much still don't rent to Black people like that. Now it's they always mysteriously smell weed if you're Black in an apartment. And I was like, I smell weed. And you're like, I don't smoke weed. So it's always something. But yeah, I mean, the particular ways that exclusion has taken place, and then of course gentrification that's taking place here. One of the things white people do here is rename their streets. So like Goddigan Street, which is where Black people live in the North End, the white people petitioned to have it changed to Nova Lee when it gets like the white era, so they wouldn't be associated with like the Black street. Or like Lake Porter is really just the white end of North Preston, but they don't want to be called North Preston, so they're like Porter's Lake. So like white people here love to change the name of their community so that it's not associated with the Black community, so that it like doesn't affect their property values. That's the thing here. Or otherwise they like move into your community and steal your community name and then talk about like they're from Hammond's Place. You're like, no, you're not from Hammond's Place. Like, that's a Black community. You're from something else, you know? But no, it's a big deal. Like community boundaries here. They're always violating like the because we have these small communities and then they always want to like now it's like, you know, North Prestwich would have been in back in the day, like that was far out, right? Like people had to walk, you know, 20 miles or whatever, you know, like it would be 2 hours to walk into town. Now, of course, with cars, it's 15 minutes out and it's desirable. So all these places, as we get urban sprawl, like people are now coming up to where the Black community is. It used to be far out, and now they're stealing everybody's land. A lot of people, our elders, don't have land title. So the land has been in the family, but there's no official documents, or people are scamming old people. So like making, you know, offering like some elderly person that maybe not in their right mind or whatever, $10,000 for their land, and then taking the land and building it up. Like selling, you know, people, and then people are poor. So if you have land in a Black community that you maybe are building on or living on and somebody offers you money for it, you're like, cool, I'll take that money. And then they're building condos or something, which then of course impacts the whole rest of the community because now there's all these like white people living in your community and your community culture is broken, right? So the Black communities here are rapidly disappearing through like a violent process of gentrification. As urban sprawl, as all these things happen, because again, we are not largely urban communities, we are largely rural communities in this province. And those are really under danger. Yeah.
And with racism comes, you know, not being able to find a job, and of course that gets people with chronic unemployment and not being able to pay the rent, as you mentioned. Nobody even gives us any rent. That's where sometimes people will get prone to crime, and then that's where, of course, they're under the they're under the racist eye of the RCMP, right?
Yeah, and I mean the usual, like no resources, flooded our community with guns, kids getting suspended from school at 3 times the rate, like all the usual factors, no jobs in the community, and then, you know, obviously leading to a certain extent to criminal involvement. Of course, we're not I don't even like to concede that we're so-called more criminally involved, because what we are is more policed, less likely to get bail, more likely to get charges stacked, more likely to be harsher sentence, more likely to be inside the youth system and not get diversion. Like those are all things, more likely to be in the child welfare system, not because of abuse, but because of neglect, which is extremely racialized, and obviously poverty as well. I think Winnipeg did a study that showed like 80% of kids taken into care, which are largely Indigenous, are not there because of abuse. They're there because somebody deemed their parents unfit in some kind of manner, you know. So all these things are true for Black people as well. So, you know, our public prosecution service is almost entirely white. I don't know if I can even count on one hand the amount of crowns that are. There might be 2 Mi'kmaq crowns and maybe 2 Black. It would be hard to get to 5.
Yeah.
And as somebody that does court support, that goes into court a lot, the amount of blatant racism I have observed from our crowns is like absolutely overwhelming. One case I'm working on right now is the Randy Riley case, an African Nova Scotian man accused of killing a white man. People can go to his website, whoisrandyriley.com. He's been incarcerated essentially his entire 20s on this case. Recently it emerged, for example, that the one witness the Crown had, admitted he was paid by the police. The police lied on the stand and said they did not pay him. He also lied and said he could not have fed him the information he wanted because he didn't know that information. That report was found hidden in the Crown's files and they never disclosed it. Evidence mysteriously went missing and somebody else confessed to the crime in open court, yet he was still convicted. So I mean,
wow.
The Crown used the word white 3 or 4 times in their closing, the white victim, the white victim, the white victim. While a Black man is sitting there. So to an all-white...
This is in the 80s or the 90s? Or
no, like 2 years ago. This is a case I'm currently working on. This young man is sitting in prison now. And I mean, one thing that happened in that trial is that we were told to avert our eyes from the jury because our Black eyes were somehow intimidating the jury. It was
you really can't make this shit up, and yet this is supposed to be liberal Canada. This is supposed to be the model of liberal democracy.
That's someone who goes to court all the time. Like this, like the kind of behavior observed from the Crown. Some of them I can't talk about because it's in cases that are under bans, but calling people's housing to try and get them evicted because they want to have their son live there on bail. And trying to get them kicked out of housing, calling people's works and trying to get them fired because they offered a job to a Black person. Like this is what our public prosecution office spends their time doing, because they believe that we are all we have a rhetoric around gun violence here that is Black, right? There'll be like one shooting and they're like, the whole community is shooting each other. And then the notion is that, like, put any nigger in jail, right? If it's a wrongful conviction on this, I'm sure he did something else. So they very aggressively prosecute Black people all the time. And there's a very disturbing pattern of dubious convictions over convictions, wrongful convictions taking place that I've observed, and there's no will to take it up. No, the media will just take the quote the Crown approvingly, take stuff from the police. So like the depths of the violence that we deal with that is so buried, like just fighting this one case, it is like absolutely absurd. And like, even though the witness has now recanted under oath and said, I lied, they are still proceeding with a retrial. Even though his appeal was successful, they are still putting this man through court and hoping for a conviction, which they may get because it will still be a white jury. So no matter what you do, it will be all white people deciding, and they see a Black face and they think, if this nigga didn't do this, he did something else, right? So the reasonable doubt is, I don't want to err on the side of error and let this nigga roam the streets. Like, that is literally, and I'm using that word deliberately because that is what it is, So, and these are things that barely anyone talks about. In fact, I'm always crazy for being the person that talks about this. I'm so extra, I'm ridiculous, I'm unqualified, I'm always ranting, I hate white people, right? Like, for raising these kind of basic issues, which obviously comes with a lot of threat to your livelihood, sometimes to your life, right? In non-racist Canada. So no, I mean, the amount of people living in these kind of conditions and the sorts of violations that take place of people in community, when you really start getting into it, you could do nothing else all day but like talk about these cases and you would not be finished.
Now, Michelle Alexander back in America talked about the new Jim Crow and of course the documentary 13th about that loophole in the 13th Amendment that Ava DuVernay did. That was all part of what Michelle Alexander called the Get Tough on Crime movement, where you gotta lock up all of these unruly Negroes and so forth if they have if they consume crack or if they are involved in crime. What did a similar movement like that happen in Canada? But of course, but because of that Canadian politeness you're talking about, was it more softly introduced by Pierre Trudeau, Mulroney, Chrétien, Paul Martin, and so forth?
So, Deborah Parks is really good on this. She's a feminist law prof out of UBC, one of the few people that really takes on issues like the life sentence. So, for example, Canada abolishes the death penalty in the early 60s, I believe. I don't have my dates right, but we abolished the death penalty, along with obviously most of the rest of the England does as well, right? So the U.S. maintains the death penalty. We abolish it, but of course, then we bring in the life sentence. And initially, the life sentence, the average is about 7 to 10 years. But of course, then that's not enough. And when you have a punishment agenda, it always has to increase.
Yeah. Uh-oh.
What happened in Canada? Some man got out on parole. Did you miss me there? Was I?
Yeah. Okay, so the end of death penalty, they introduced
a life regime, right? That, okay, then we need life sentences for these serious crimes instead of executing people, which initially the average is about 10 years before parole. But then, of course, some guy gets out on parole and kills somebody. So this is always how law works, right? Somebody makes a big deal. So some parliamentarian goes in and says, 10 years isn't enough. So it becomes 25, right? So unlike the States, the principle of our system is supposed to be that the top sentence is 25 years. So there should always be rehabilitation because you are eventually getting out. We don't do the sort of 300-year sentence. But of course, then that's not enough. So people don't like that it's only 25 years. So one of the things that's, of course, we put in now is dangerous offender, which is or indefinite sentences where they're allowed to keep people longer. Now this is an issue in the mosque shooting, right, where Bissonnette was given consecutive life sentences. Justin Bourque was given 75 years. So now there's people arguing that 25 is not sufficient and we need these other ways to extend punishment, right? So this always happens, right? That we start with an idea that what's normal punishment one day becomes it's too little punishment the next day, and then it gets excessive, and then the excessive punishment becomes the too little punishment. So then 25 was supposed to be the excessive punishment, and now people get mad because 25 isn't enough, right? That's 25 for your first chance of parole, by the way. So if you're convicted of first-degree murder, you get an automatic 25-year sentence. That doesn't mean you only do 25 years. It just means the first time you can go up for parole is 25 years. You never get parole on the first try. So in reality, people are there 30 years. I know a guy on 37 years because he killed a police officer. And so, like, they're never going to let him out. They always manufacture a way. Every time he gets close to parole, they manufacture some reason to send him to a higher security institution and interrupt his ability to get parole. Like, you know, these things happen all the time. So we have, again, a bit of a different trajectory. Like, our people in prison can vote in Canada federally. They can't in the States, you know. That's because of the Sauvé case. So in some ways, obviously, it's different. But, yeah, I mean, we have an unaccountable parole board that, you know, you can't really get hold of their decisions. There's certainly no racialized data on that, like race disaggregated data, as people love to talk about. We don't have good data on what's happening with Black people in front of parole. But yeah, I mean, but similarly through the 70s, like the war on drugs bleeds here, and a lot of our police train in the States, right? Like our police chief now, Dan Kinsella, trained at Quantico. That's very common for top police people. If they want to get into police management, they're trained in the States. And I'm not suggesting that the States is the only source of violence, but I'm suggesting if you live in the world's prison capital that, you know, incarcerates 25% of the world's people and has, you know, the most militarized police force, what happens when Canadian police come down and are trained in those methods? We know that that's then imported back into Canada and we become more violent. We're very much tied into these, like our police chief is big on surveillance and, you know, like data, meaning like, you know, obviously using stingray technology and facial recognition technology. And yeah, they train in the United States. So this information is going back and forth. When they put in so-called legalized cannabis here, which isn't really legalization because they added charges when we legalized cannabis, but in so-called legalization now they can stop you for any reason. Like they don't need reasonable suspicion to pull your car over. They can just stop you and test you and ask you like if you're high. And part of the test is just like staring in your face and like observing your pupils. And the way that they train on that, it turns out, is they sent cops down to the States, to Arizona, and I believe to Florida, so two extremely racist places, and like literally get prisoners high and have the cops like learn to identify being high from these like experiments, which of course is going to be Black people, and you know that's the faces you're looking at as you had learned to identify highness. So is there any surprise that traffic stops are overwhelmingly Black for drug stops? You know, like these are the kind of relationships that are taking place.
And the legalization of pot has not done a thing to dent the over-incarceration of...
Well, they didn't really create amnesty, and then they did a sort of half-assed belated amnesty that didn't really like address amnesty. When we did legalization, they actually shut down dispensaries. So whereas in California, for example, they actually designated a certain proportion of licenses, understanding that Black people have been most over-incarcerated for drugs and therefore are owed, you know, the ability to make money off cannabis. Here we actually, it's controlled by the province, so they actually shut down and raid all the dispensaries. So there's no possibility for like a Black community to, you know, create, like start growing and like create a business. They deliberately like made sure that wasn't going to happen. Right before they legalized, they actually did a study, and 50% of drug stops were like Black people. So it was essentially legalized for white people and not for Black people. And of course, because you don't need reasonable suspicion, it's just a way to pull people over anyway. So, yeah, no, I mean, don't believe anything Canada says.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. I mean,
now, of course, and this is what I mean about landlords always claiming they're smelling weed. So now that it's legal, like my landlord harasses me and is always claiming that I'm smoking weed or she can smell weed or this or that, and like because now you see a Black person in the hallways and it somehow comes with the scent of weed, and of course they can evict you for smoking weed, like you know, it's like the new thing.
Even when it's legal.
Well, it's legal, but you can't, like, obviously apartments and buildings and stuff ban it. Like just because it's legal doesn't mean they have to let you smoke it in housing or like in your apartment or whatever. You know, so it's not legal. It's also illegal to sell to a minor. So like if an 18-year-old sells to a 17-year-old, you can be facing up to 14 years in jail. It's illegal to have it open in your car and not in a sealed container. Like I think it's like 47 charges now. So we went from like 3 charges, like possession, trafficking, and like intent to sell. And now we have like all the selling to a minor, driving high. Like they actually increased like all the charges. So legalization is actually like led to more criminalization. And of course, directed at Black people.
and the constant harassment of just being a Black person and just being, you know, a non-white Canadian. Where does Brian Mulroney's free trade, where did that play a part, as well as Chris Hen and Paul Martin's welfare reform, and I think they kind of approached those socioeconomic issues the way Clinton and Tony Blair did, which I call Neo-Dickensianism. I hate that term neoliberalism. I call it Neo-Dickensian because it's so classist how they approach you when you're on welfare and so forth, and how you can get welfare, and if you haven't, yeah. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, so Senator Kim Pate, who was the former executive director of the Elizabeth Fry Societies of Canada, which do prison advocacy, they're abolitionist for women. So, I mean, she has a good essay talking about how austerity politics through the 70s, 80s, 90s, this is what leads to women's incarceration rates really shooting up as we cut the public safety net, for example. Over 50% of women in jail are disabled, people living with disabilities, because we haven't it's like you get $580 a month still for housing, and most housing in Halifax, we live on a peninsula. There's a housing crisis. You can't really find housing under $850 in Halifax, but you're only getting $580. So of course, then people are concentrated in particular buildings that often exclude
disabled people being put in jail.
Oh yeah, jails are the largest warehousing of people with mental illness and disabilities. Like, because we don't have treatment, we don't resource it, especially women with disabilities. Who turn to, crimes like shoplifting or welfare fraud or whatever. But remember, welfare fraud can also be like the father of your child doesn't live with you and gave you money for back to school and you didn't declare it. That's welfare fraud, right? We don't give people enough money for medication, so people on assistance are cutting their medication in half or skipping and taking it every third day. Like these are the things that are happening. So, and that's of course a direct result to austerity politics, which particularly impacted women. So yeah, you see a huge increase in the incarceration of women. In the 90s, so right before we used to have one prison for women, Kingston Prison for Women, and there was never more than like 40 federally incarcerated women, period. Now there's over 500. So that rate has gone up and is continually going up, and particularly Indigenous women, who now make up almost half of the federal prison population, meaning everyone serving more than 2 years, right? Like pen time, hard time. And like I said, there's a huge correlation with disability. Many of women who have like cognitive damage from abuse, right? Like being thrown against the wall, being kicked in the face, and perhaps, for example, don't have lost their short-term memory, also due to stress, can't remember an appointment, maybe they have a welfare fraud charge or bounced a check or shoplifted something. You get put on conditions and then you don't remember your appointment and now you're in jail, right? Like this is how a lot of these things snowball. So yeah, that's a direct relationship to the neoliberal, whatever you want to call it, policy of cutting the social safety net, of removing the public services. And that is always accompanied by a rise in the prison population. So yes, the war on drugs, but also, of course, yeah, the social causes of criminalization. So we've had
all that.
the same trajectory of rising prison population. And again, we tend to attribute that to the States. Canada's like 8th or 9th in the world or something. Like, we're up there. And one of the interesting things is that as the states, even conservatives in the States, are starting to acknowledge some, small idea of prison reform, Canada is building supermax prisons. So we are continually saying, like, we need these different kind of prisons. Sorry, 1 second. I'm just seeing a jail call. I want to see who it is. So I guess I'll have to cut.
Yeah. Go ahead.
This is a free
Sorry.
call from.
Okay, it's Randy. I'm going to just talk to him for 2 seconds. You don't mind. You can cut this, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can do that.
Live.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring.
But do you want to say hi to him? Hang on.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Hey, Randy, what's up? Do you want to say hi to Youri? I'm doing this interview. He's in Belgium, and I was telling him about your case. Do you want to just say hi? I always do this to you, but I was telling him about your wrongful conviction. So do you want to just say hi to Youri and maybe say a little bit about your case? Hang on, I'm putting you on speaker. Just say what you want to say, and then how much longer are we gonna? Oh,
almost done. I just got 3 more left.
Okay. A super dope advocate out there, an Afro-Belgian guy. Well, he's Afro-Dutch, but he lives in Belgium. So hang on, just say hi. I'm putting you on speaker. Can you hear?
Hello there.
Yeah. Hey.
Yes,
Youri.
I can hear you. All right,
man. Hey, what's up, man? I hope things are looking good for you, dear.
Things are looking good, but I was just talking to Ms.Jones about the terrible state of affairs and the plight of Black people and the over-incarceration, the very Dickensian laws that are happening in Canada, and she was telling me about your case. What's the latest that's going on with it, though?
At this moment, I'm been granted a retrial. I'm trying to get bail, and they just seem to be pulling all the stops against me. A lot of fabricating of evidence. With it seems like a never-ending story. I think maybe I can get Elle to send a link to my website that I have posted with like a lot of the information regarding my case, so you can be informed.
I would definitely be interested, and I'm sure many people of the social justice movement would definitely love to be involved with this, because it is incredible how Canada, which likes to have this image that they're the better version of the United States, from what I'm hearing from Ms.Jones, it sounds as if they are just as bad, if not worse, than the U.S. and the other settler colonial states.
The phrase that, the saying that I know of people saying that I think puts it right to the point is, in America they serve their racism with a growl. Up here they serve it to you with a smile.
That is the best way to describe Canada. Yeah, and how Canada conducts itself. Unbelievable, though.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to say, Randy? Just like what you might want people in Belgium or Europe to know? Anything else?
Just the fact that it's the racism here is just as prevalent as it is down south of us, and I'm here doing the best I can to stay positive and keep focused. But if you could carry my story out there, man, I would appreciate that, just so it can be circulated, and maybe some public pressure can bring some justice for me.
It would be an honor to do that, and I will make sure that that when I upload this onto YouTube, Ms.Jones will send me the link to your case so that people can check it out and they get involved. No problem. Would be an honor.
Okay, Randy, I'm going to take you off speaker for a sec. Okay. When did the phone shut off? Like now? Oh, okay. Because I'm in the middle of this interview, but I want to talk to you. But okay, cool. All right, you're good though. All right. Okay, cool. Give me a call tomorrow. All right, I'll talk to you soon. Okay. All right. Have a good night. Okay, bye.
Well, Ms.Jones, you more or less answered a lot.
It's fine. You might as well keep it all in. It's fine.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you more or less. Well, okay. I'll try to wrap up very quickly then, because you actually sort of just like answered most of the questions that I wanted to ask you, but okay. So I think three last questions then is you were talking about these terrible Dickensian policies that are put in place on Black Canadians and women of color, and it's just astounding. And but I'm sure the CBC, the Globe and Mail, even though they are very much establishment friendly, talk about this, or is that or is that only the occasional documentary? Because if you tell the truth about Canada, its whole world falls apart.
Well, and obviously there's a lot of reporters that are progressive and want to talk about these things. So it is talked about. I don't know that it's talked about the extent it should be. So in COVID, for example, that first people didn't want to cover COVID in prisons, and then they did start covering that. And there was huge coverage on the idea that COVID was spreading very quickly in the prisons, that the federal government refused to release prisoners in order to alleviate COVID and keep people safe. But then you also get stories like everyone being mad that they were giving people in prison the vaccine, and being outraged that prisoners got the vaccine. So it's like both kind of sides. So yeah, I don't want to say there's no coverage. There is. People will do stories, but at the same time, does that lead to substantial change? We just got a so-called justice reform bill literally yesterday. But it decriminalizes simple possession charges for drugs. It doesn't fully decriminalize drugs. It maintains Crown and police.
But then on top of that, I mean, I can't tell you how shocked it is to hear that weed has been legalized in Canada and you're still being harassed for it. I mean, it's just. I mean, it's just it's just astounding, and in the case of Randy, like he has been vindicated. He has been vindicated, and still, I mean, it's just, I mean, that's just. I mean, it's just shocking the injustice that takes place.
Yeah, and I mean, Randy's case is only one of many. That's Randy, as you heard from him. I mean, he is able to fight for himself and is a tremendous leader. Is in fact the leader of the prison strike in 2018. He was instrumental in that Burnside prison strike when the prison held a 3-week strike, both in solidarity with the United States and also, of course, in their own issue. That strike has gone on to influence other strikes as hunger strikes in immigration and other detention facilities are taking place. So that was Randy's work, for example. So a really important abolitionist in Canada, somebody who is really organizing the prison, but of course, is under this racist wrongful conviction where he continues to be persecuted for. So, and that is just like not uncommon. That is there's nothing surprising in this case.
And where is the people? And where's the people power movement? Where is the social justice movement that's pushing back against this? And as many of are many of the people trying to push back against this is it black led? Is it indigenous led? Is it a coalition or?
I mean, we've been fighting this case since he was arrested in 2013, and very much, especially now, a lot of Black people know him, know his community. He's from a community, Cherrybrook, a historic Black community, and of course, everybody in Cherrybrook. If you ever read Until We Are Free, the history of the Black Lives Matter movement in Canada, there's an essay, the opening essay in that book is written by me and Randy together. And one of the things I talk about is going to his mother's funeral where they brought him in from prison in shackles and how the community really stood against and stood up for him and, showed love to him and really pushed back against this notion that he was going to be contained or in any way policed at this funeral. And it was an example of kind of community-based abolition where people weren't coming with a theory of abolition. They just knew that this was their child in their community and that the sheriffs were not going to prevent him from touching his children on that day. You know what I mean? So there's those kind of relationships. I just literally, as I looked down at my phone, I had a message from somebody talking about Randy to me, a Black person. So it is very much growing in the Black community. And then I think there are white people as well. But it's always difficult with a wrongful conviction because before somebody's a wrongfully convicted person who's a cause célèbre, they're a monster. So a lot of people are very worried about defending murderers, but there's harm and, you face a lot of shaming. I mean, when you're in court, you because there's the idea that you're adjacent to guilt, right? And that if you dare to be in relation with this person, you are equally monstrous. So it's a difficult thing to take on. There is a victim's family in this case, and that's not their fault. They are living in trauma and pain. There's nothing they did wrong, of course, but people, it is difficult, right? And then if the person's exonerated, then everyone's like, ooh, what a amazing thing. And it imagines that they would have been the person fighting for that. But it's actually a very hard road because you have to believe the person. You have to take on the idea that, you're an awful person who defends murderers. What don't you care about victims? You go to court and you face the Crown harassing you. You get harassed in general. You get harassed on social media. It's not pleasant, right? And I'm not the one living in jail. So it is a difficult thing to take on, but it's definitely growing now. A lot of Black people, in this case in particular, are definitely throwing in as knowledge of this is gained, So international solidarity on this case and others would be much appreciated,
Well, second to last question then is, there's all this talks about, defunding the police, and you've mentioned a lot about abolitionism and so forth, and now you're more or less part of an abolition movement. Now, I definitely want to abolish the Canadian deep states and the military and the CIA and the NSA, but on the issue of police, I'm still very much agnostic about it. There's still a part of me that thinks that the police are that awful term, unnecessary evil. So are you? So yes, but where do you stand on that? Are you of the opinion, like Miriam Haddad, who actually who believes in abolishing the police because she says you can't reform an institution which was founded to be racist. Are you of that opinion, or
that your sort of caveat is you're like, but I can't, that this imagination that if we didn't have the police, then criminals would be roaming the streets. The question,
yeah,
but why would we need police to that? Why can't we imagine a community structure that would do the same function without the guns and the violence and the racially profiling, right? So I think the fundamental problem here is that we're taught that the police are the only, because the police are the only institution we have for dealing with harm, we then project that they are the necessary and only institution capable of dealing with it. And that's simply not true. We did things before police, and we can do something after police. So nobody is suggesting that we should remove all social controls. And, if we got rid of police, we simply would not police crime. First of all, let's understand that crime is largely a category created by the elites to support power. So why is, environmental destruction not a crime, but littering is, like that? You can get fined for littering, and you can, of course, dump all your oil into the ocean, and that's fine, right? Why? The number one theft is wage theft, right? Like employers stealing their employees' wages. But you can't call 911 and be like, my boss isn't paying me for my overtime, like 911 theft in progress, right? So we know that the very category of crime is a fictional one. It highlights street-based crime. It does not highlight financial-based crime, corporate crime, all of those things. So let's not pretend, first of all, that criminals don't get away with it every day, when we know that corporate, white-collar, government criminals and they are always committing crimes and getting away with far more violent crimes than none of us could murder as many people as these corporations murder, like even if we tried, Like there's not enough time in the day to murder as many people as corporations murder, and none of them face anything other than, a fraction of their morning's profit, Like, so.
And the violence of the states.
Yeah, and of course they always.
Indigenous poverty alone. Gandhi once said that violence is the worst form of poverty, and the apartheid that Indigenous people, but even the apartheid that you've just been describing to me, that the average, Black woman, Black working class Canadian faces. That's a crime against humanity in and of itself.
Yeah, so people will say we need police because of what it's about sexual violence. Well, only 1% to 2% of sexual assaults end up in any kind of conviction now. And typically the average time is like 2 years. Often you're out at 2/3, so less than 2 years in prison. Pedophiles don't do a lot of time; they get 2 to 5 years. So these things that we imagine that sentencing takes care of actually doesn't. If sentencing people dealt with sexual violence, we would be seeing those rates dropping, and they're not. We have zero tolerance on domestic violence, and there's not been a drop in domestic violence. So we know that prison doesn't actually work to solve that. People are being raped now, and their rapists are not being put in jail. So to say, well, we need policing in jail for rape, well, I'd love to see the moment when the police actually do anything about rape, because generally what they're doing is dismissing rape victims and hiding their rape kits, So the system doesn't work now for that. And, when we look at transformative justice formed by Black women, those are Black women who are victims of violence. These aren't people outside of violence. These are people who have experienced intimate violence, incest, domestic violence, rape, and understand that the system is not going to deal with it. So it's not about naivety. I'm not an abolitionist because I live up in fairyland and I just don't get that people are violent. I talk to people from prison every single day. Many of the people I talk to are the people that are considered the most violent because they are the least served. So the ones that find their way to my kind of freelance prison abolitionist phone, where I'm providing services. So I know exactly, intimately, people who are the violent people that we can't imagine ever being human. So it's not out of naivety that I believe that prisons don't work. It's actually because I every day experience what the prison system looks like. I am also myself, I'm a Black woman. You think I don't have a history of violence? There's not violence in my family, that, I'm not familiar with crime. So yeah, I think the myth here is this idea that because police is the only thing we allow to deal with crime, then we say, well, you would call 911 if someone broke into your house with a gun. Well, yeah, I would, because there's no one else for me to call. But that doesn't mean that I can't imagine a world where there was the elder council that would be available, or that, something based in my community that would be available for this. And then, of course, what would the person be breaking into my home if they had a safe home and had treatment for their trauma in the first place, right? So abolition.
So what would you say? Because I know Miriam Haddad was for abolishing the RCMP, but getting to a place where that can happen.
Yeah, well, this is exactly.
So then what would you say then to the current leader of the Green Party of Canada? And I'm pretty sure many people also have the attitude that she expressed, which is, which is, yes, I'm for social justice reforms, but no amount of social justice reforms will stop a murderer or a rapist. So what would you say to that argument?
I'm not sure that's true. I mean, the vast majority of murders are over drugs and street beef, right? So if you actually I mean, there's the domestic violence murders, right? Men that kill women. And then the other sort of big subset is like killing over drugs and money. A lot of that's on the streets. So yes, actually you wouldn't, people aren't waking up and being like, I could go to medical school, but I think I'll hit these streets, right? Like that is in fact often a lack of opportunity that is traced back to childhood trauma. Everybody usually has a history of trauma. People will say, they care about rape victims. 90+% of women in jail are victims of physical sexual assault. Those are rape victims. That is all
women in jail.
Yeah, 90 over
who were sexual assault victims. Most of the women in jail.
We're like it's called the sexual assault to prison pipeline. The number one factor for women for future incarceration is abuse. Like women who are abused end up in jail.
Because of the mental illness, the trauma, and them self-medicating through.
Exactly, and like it's largely and I don't love this category, but it's largely nonviolent crime. Barely any women are guilty of violent crime, so it's like shoplifting and driving the car for your boyfriend, like storing drugs in your house. Like that's the kind of stuff that women get largely incarcerated for. But women are victims of violence who are incarcerated, and that's not untrue for men. It's just men don't disclose it as much. But in a lot of my work, a lot of the men that are doing hard time were victims of childhood molestation, assault as well. It's the overriding factor is in fact childhood trauma. So yes, in fact, quite a few amounts of social justice would probably reduce a lot of that just starting with that. But nobody's arguing that the serial killers, though the sociopaths should be out of prison. Nobody is arguing that. We all understand that those people are not safe. It's just like, what would that look like? It doesn't have to look like the industrial style prison we have now. Nobody thinks Paul Bernardo should be roaming these streets or Robert Pickton should be roaming these streets. But that is different from a mass incarceration system. So we can talk about those people who are unsafe, keeping us safe from them and keeping, frankly, them safe, so that they aren't out here committing violence. We can talk about that without investing in the notion of a prison system, that, there's this somehow moral weight of punishment, right? Those are different things. So yeah, nobody is arguing like, well, poor serial killers, just give them a hug. People who are like, molesting dozens of children. Oh yeah, like kiss, 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 hug, hug, hug. Obviously those people are not safe. But I would suggest that, again, for a state that claims to care about those things, look how long it took to catch Robert Pickton in Canada. And in fact, the spokeswoman for the RCMP at the time ended up testifying for the victims. And the reason was because the RCMP, instead of actually pursuing Pickton, was too busy watching porn, harassing her, and like basically, dismissing the victims because some of them are Indigenous or sex workers. And like the RCMP, in fact, has one of the largest sexual assault, sexual harassment suits out, right? Like the woman who worked for the RCMP are so there's gendered violence inside the police, right? So they can't really turn around and be like, you need us to fight gendered violence, when in fact they're committing gendered violence at a much wider scale. And yeah, we're not catching actual serial killers. At one point, there was a woman who escaped with the handcuff key from Pickton, and they didn't believe her. So
that reminds me so much of the Dutroux scandal. Don't know if you're familiar with that. In Belgium, there was this serial killer pedophile who actually was part of the Belgian deep state and the Belgian elites and so forth. But that's I'll send you the link to that episode I had with Elizabeth Voss. But yeah, that sounds exactly. It wasn't incompetence which was why he got away with his crimes. It was because he was sanctioned by the states. So yeah.
So the issue isn't that therefore we would allow violence to run rampant. I would suggest that what happens now is there's very little accountability for violence because you serve your sentence and then you're out and you can commit more violence because we're not actually dealing with it. And that's in fact what we see, that people go to jail and then they become, once you're in a kind of criminalized cycle, you recommit crimes, right? So I'm not advocating that we should somehow allow violence. I'm saying that jail and policing do not actually get to the roots of violence. If they worked, we would be seeing them working. They're not. Crime levels at their lowest level, in fact, since the 1960s, like since 1969, we have the lowest crime levels, yet we're over incarcerating more people than ever. So there is no relationship between incarceration and crime. The vast majority of incarceration is not, of course, violence. The vast majority of what police do is not solving murders. It's like driving around harassing people for bylaws and like traffic vehicle violations. So what we imagine the police do all day is that, because we watch Law and Order, we think every day they're called out on a murder. They are not. You know, they are largely, it's like coming to people's houses on noise complaints. So, I think the obviously complex question is, what do we do with violence and harm? What do we do with psychopaths? What do we do with serial killers? And that obviously, but that is not, it's only if we watch TV a lot that we think that that's the entire jail, when in fact that's a very small proportion of people. And even people who are guilty of violent crimes does not mean that those people cannot make reparation, cannot take accountability, and are not capable of transformation and real, true reparation. Because again, like this idea that we just defer this into the system, and like we know that victims are not served by this system. You don't really get justice, you don't get closure, that you're not offered anything that you need. So the system does not work. It does not prevent crime. It does not address crime. It costs a huge amount of money. It's $271 per day to incarcerate a person in my province. It was during COVID when we released almost half the population provincially. We never did federal releases, but we did do provincially. And it was $125 for people to live in supportive housing with groceries, with full social work support. So less than half to keep people out of jail. And there was no crime wave that emerged, and that showed us that most of what we're doing with jail is incarcerating poor people, incarcerating people with disabilities, incarcerating people with addictions and mental health issues. And that is not, it's a ridiculous system. It doesn't work, and it doesn't do the things you want it to do. So in fact, if you want to be tough on crime, you should be looking at actually resourcing communities and not resourcing the police, who are basically entirely useless and only show up once a crime is being committed, or to kill like people on mental health checks, So
And before I ask this final question, are the people involved in the movements in this very radical, real criminal justice, social justice movement, racial justice movement, Indigenous justice movement, are many of them connecting their calls to abolish the police or to radically reform the police to the anti-imperialism, which you're also part of?
That not so much. I think people definitely connect to the environmental movement and certainly understand the connection of prison and, for example, that prisons are in small towns that have often lost their resources. So they've lost like mining or fishing or whatever, and like replace it with a prison. So I think there's some link that we try to make between the environmental movement. Certainly, people understand abolition in the capitalist frame. I think anybody who talks about abolition always says, this is based in capitalism. We have to rethink, capitalist hierarchies and the disposability culture of capitalism. And, the idea that there will always be somebody outside the norm and outside the public in capitalism, because capitalism thrives upon this. We obviously can connect it to the history of slavery and colonialism. There is much less connection because there is not a big anti-war discourse period or anti-imperial on the left in Canada, again, right? Yeah. In Halifax, we actually have a good history of women and the feminist movement and peace movement, because there's a lot of, especially older women now, that were involved in the anti-nuclear movement and, chaining themselves to bridges to prevent. We have a lot of nuclear subs and stuff that come through our harbor, right? Because we're a port town. The Americans are always doing like military exercises, like out of our port, In my somewhat forthcoming book, I actually have this essay about when I get invited to go onto this giant nuclear-powered aircraft carrier for like July 4th. Like that's very common, right? We have like American military exercises. But there isn't that form of leftist discourse and it's very much concentrated in older people. When you go to anti-war protests, it's like a lot of like old people. It hasn't really spread to the younger left. And this is, I suppose, partly a function of, I'm not using identity politics in the right, this is a right-wing way of calling everything that's racial solidarity, but the bourgeois kind of identity politics. Yeah. I think a lot of young people aren't necessarily well-grounded in leftist politics in that, because, a lot of people, so you get a lot of that kind of bourgeois, like surface stuff, like be mad at Abercrombie and Fitch because of the T-shirt they're selling, but we're not talking about funding the military and how. So yeah, I think that's a weakness in leftist discourse. I'm not blaming young people here. I'm saying like we're not training up young people into this discourse, right? And then when you go on Twitter, that's where you're learning your politics. And if people aren't talking about it, so I think we have to revive the peace movement in Canada.
Which is part of the Canadian truth-telling movement, which is where people like Eve Engler, Dimitri Lascaris, Jay Watts of the Communist Party of Canada, and those sort of voices, and your colleagues like like Tamara and so forth, right?
Yeah. So, but I mean, like that's very much not mainstream leftist discourse, and certainly then, of course, when you get to the Black left, obviously Black people are busy trying to handle our business, like what with cops around us all the time and like, getting evicted for smelling like weed, like we have a lot to take on. So it's difficult for Black people also to,
But that said,
you
but
know,
that said, but
like,
that said, but that said, as I've said many times on this program, you cannot be an environmentalist, let alone an eco-socialist, and support any form of militarism. This is what I was so pissed off when I was hearing you and Tamara in a panel with Randall Garrison of the NDP talking about militarism, and just like, you cannot talk about Black Lives Matter and talk about ending police brutality and either stay silent or de facto support
a lot of Black
military, which stops and frisks the world and brutalizes the world.
But the military is also seen as a really good job that Black people can go into because you only need high school, right? You can get out of high school, you get this job that you can retire from at 40 with like a full pension. So that's always been the problem for Black people. One of our sort of heroes in Nova Scotia is William Hall, because he won the Victoria Cross. What did he win it doing? Fighting in the Indian Mutiny, right? Like the rebellion for the British government. So we haven't begun to unpack that. Like, we're all about the number 2 construction battalion here is a big deal because they dug the trenches and the toilets in World War I. But of course, the question being, why the fuck would Black people go do that? And the answer is because they were facing racist terrorist violence at home. Like, The Birth of a Nation is coming out in 1915, right? Which is like glorifying the KKK. And apparently they did try to show it in Halifax, but they were recruiting for the number 2 construction battalion and thought that might be a bad look. In other words, come join the military or we'll fucking KKK you, like we'll burn your shit down. So of course you're like, I guess I'm going to go dig a toilet. It wasn't that they were like necessarily attached to Canada, but of course there's also this idea that citizenship has been earned to us through military. So we like in Black History Month, you'll get like so-and-so fought in World War I and they were a hero because it's like how we were able. So Black people haven't begun to unpack that, right? We still talk about like Buffalo Soldiers, but they were, of course, committing genocide on Indigenous people, right? So those kind of really complex colonial histories, it's not like we sit around studying this in school. Black people already are like kicked out of school. So it's like, when do Black people have the time to sit around and like contemplate, Canada's history in World War I? So it's just a difficult conversation to start that requires a lot of political information that people don't necessarily have the privilege to have access to in the first place. And then like the white left and the black left, that's obviously not necessarily connected. So I think of like Margaret Kimberley and Ajabu Baraka and, like the Black Alliance for Peace, like which is a really important movement, which is returning that into the Black left, right? That understanding that these are actually issues that like the average Black person should care about. But that's exactly why they had to start that, because typically now Black politics will talk about policing. We obviously talk about diversity, like wanting representation. We talk about like needing data. But we don't really talk about.
We need more Obamas, and we need more Black people to join the police, and then everything is going to be, and then
high places. When we were fighting Abdul Abdi, our immigration minister was not only Black but Somali, who was a refugee himself, but he was quite willing to deport people to the very same country that was too dangerous for him to be in, right? Like, which, and then people like, Black people were mad at us because we were attacking an important Black person in public, right? So it's a difficult politic, but that's a failure all over the place. It's not just Black people, it's
Indigenous people as well. Me and Eve had a very big conversation about that on the first episode of the show.
Like, no, the NDP will not find them ever in it. There's no debate that we have on war, defunding the military. Like, it's unpopular. And of course, I live in Halifax, in a port city. It's a military town. We have the military tattoo every year. It's a big thing where for nights, all the different military bands come in and perform. Like, this is a militarized city. The girls we get American soldiers in, and a lot of people get their boyfriend that way, like there's a lot of baby, because it's like, like a lot of Black people are related here. So when the Black American soldiers come in, people are like, good, like I can be with someone who's not my cousin, you know what I mean? Like it's a thing, like there's a whole military thing here. So that's like hard to unpack, but, and certainly again, like, we have enforced poppyism on Remembrance Day, all of that, and that the left has not been at all active or good in actually challenging that. It's a huge failure of the modern left.
Well, I only hope that the Canadian anti-imperialist movement, or what I call the truth movement, because it's all about also speaking the truth. And as we say, Canada just can't accept, all of those inconvenient truths and myth busting.
Well, just for
But
one example, and then I know we got to wrap this up, but
Yeah.
when we opened the Canadian Human Rights Museum in Winnipeg, and I'm originally a Winnipegger, not originally because I was born in Canada, but, you know, my first place of living in Canada was Winnipeg. So we have this Canadian Human Rights Museum. The very first exhibit, when they opened the museum, one of the first exhibits was on loan from the Canadian Museum of War, and it was an exhibit on Canada's history of peacekeeping. And like in our Human Rights Museum, we're like, look at how awesome peacekeepers we are. So then they asked people to like put on post-it notes like your positive experience of Canadian peacekeeping. So I said I was a Somali child tortured by Canadian troops in Somalia, and I put that on the board. But of course, they like took it down. So.
Well, Ms.Jones, this was a fantastic episode, and thank you so much, because I really wanted to do a special Black History Month special, especially on all things Canada. And I'm gonna let you go because we won't have time for you to read a poem or two of you, because you have some important appointments to do, right?
No, the phone's shut off. So I can do a poem for you if you want. I'll do the Canada poem and then we'll end.
Yes. Go right ahead.
Control the phone system. They don't let people make you calls after 8:30 p.m. We're done. So I'll do this poem. This is the title poem of my book, my next book, Canada is So Polite. Canada is so polite. It's like someone bumps into us in the Tim Hortons line and we say sorry. We're always saying sorry. Well, I mean, not to the Indigenous people for stealing their land. And Harper only kind of apologized to residential schools while crossing the fingers on his hand. And not to Angelique, who we hanged. And not to everyone we bombed in Afghanistan. And not for the internment of the Japanese or for the deaths on the railroad built by the Chinese. And not for breaking the treaties or racist immigration policies. But we're so polite. We always say please. Well, not to our migrant workers or imported nannies, but they should get down on their knees because Canada is the promised land. But there was no slavery, just the Underground Railroad. So forget about the ads for runaway slaves in the Halifax newspapers. Canada is a safe haven for lazy immigrants who come here and we just give you welfare earned by hard-working white taxpayers because Canada is so white. Just rosy-cheeked white people playing in the snow and the ice. Just snowshoeing and canoeing all day and night. And okay, those things were stolen from Indigenous people too, but we invented hockey, right? Oh wait, it was Black people who invented the slap shot and butterfly goaltending. Well, we hide that all out of sight. And that's why Canada is so quiet, because everyone in Canada is so nice. And let's not mention the Shelburne race riots, or cross burnings, or Africville, or 2,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women, but there's no genocide. It's rude to raise your voice in Canada. So let's just smile. Canadians aren't racist. We're peacekeepers. We're civilized. And Don Cherry's a national icon, but Canadians aren't violent or bigots. That's just hockey fights. Canadians are perky. Now, there's no dirty secrets here. Canada is just quirky. Like we say Z and not Z. But if you talk about racism, we'll be like Zzz. There's no need for that here. Canada is never abusive. Canada is so inclusive. Canada is so inclusive, and the proof is that we let other people be here. It's like, I just stole your land and now I'm throwing a party, but you can stand at the back if you show us ID. It's like, I just put you in the hospital, but here, let me start you at IV. It's like, what are you complaining for? You got 6 weeks of the Book of Negroes on TV. It's like, we're going to hoard all the toys. We might just give you one if you ask us nicely. It's like, we can acknowledge you have things to offer us, but that's not likely. It's like, PK Subban. We might let you be on the Olympic hockey team if you just stop being so Black. I mean, so hockey. It's not about race. It's about character. It's just your attitude. We're not saying anything ugly. We just don't want you to embarrass the country. I mean, you should realize you're so lucky. It's not like America here. There's no history of segregation. That's why we wear Canadian flags in our backpacks when we travel abroad, because Canada has such a good reputation. Okay, we get to travel. You probably don't, but you just don't know how to teach English to those Asians or build houses in Africa. The country, of course, not the continent. Canadians are helpful because Canada is so tolerant, which means we know your culture is worse than ours, but we let you do your primitive things because Canada is so confident that we know better than you because our way of doing things is just dominant. We even let you wear your hijab. Unless it's Quebec. It's just unfortunate that your culture makes you so oppressed. It's not about racism. It's just about respect for our shared values. But we like your little costumes. They're so colorful because Canada is multicultural. We just wish that all you people of color could be more punctual. It's just that white culture is just more functional. But we just love diversity and forget about how so much of the country votes conservative. It's just amazing that so many different cultures go to our child's nursery. But then we complain when you get an affirmative action bursary. Canada's multicultural, as long as you put white people first. We like your food, fun, and fashion, but past that, isn't it kind of like racism in reverse? I mean, it's so unfair how Black and Native people get free university. We just want to make sure that everyone's worthy because Canada has so much courtesy. We speak English and French. Okay, not perfectly. Okay, most people only know the French words for cereals, but let's not be absurd. This is still an English country, or haven't you heard? There's no distinct societies in Canada. And that's why Canada is so bland. Nothing to see here, just miles upon miles of stolen Indigenous land. Just fishermen and farmers and maple syrup, because that's Canada's brand. Just fields of wheat and outdoor ice rinks and all thy son's command. No, there's no guns and violence here, just socialist healthcare plans. And just ignore the environmental damage of the oil sands, because Canada is so grand, so good at perpetuating this international scam, so sincere at pretending there's no blood on our hands, because Canada's not like that. Canada's white as a lamb. And those other people, they're so angry. But true Canadians just don't understand. Thank you.
Well, Ms. Jones, on this on that fantastic note, thank you so much. I think that was my favorite poem I've heard of yours. I love your one not one drop in. We built this city, but I'll make sure to link to that when I upload this. So on this note, we are joined on this.
You heard a woman's gonna send the bombs. You heard that poem, right?
I love that one. I love that one as well.
You're on. I'm trying to figure out what you saw. Yeah.
Well, on this edition of 1+1, we were joined by the brilliant L. Jones, who I hope we have on more as a regular. Ms. Jones, thank you so much for joining us. Make sure I'll email me so that you can can send me the links
and
to.
For everybody, check out Randy Riley's website. So in that interval, you see me take the call and everything with Randy. Please check out whoisrandyriley.com. And we're going to be doing more updates to that site as well as the case progresses. He's up in trial in October, where we obviously hope that he'll be exonerated and acquitted, but there is no guarantee of that. So any international solidarity is much sought for in this case.
And for my Canadian audience, for the people who do follow me in Canada, what's the name of the radio show if people want to check you out?
Black Power Hour. So it's on 88.1. Yes, 88.1. I had a mind moment there. 88.1 FM. You can listen online at ckdu.ca. We're actually just coming back. We were obviously on COVID hiatus because it's housed in the university and the radio station was closed. We're not smart enough to do it at home, I guess. I don't know. So, but it's usually Wednesday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern.
Make sure to make sure to send me the link to that so that
that's ckdu.ca. You can listen, but we're not currently on CKDU, but we will be back. So,
alrighty. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Jones. It was a real honor to speak to you, and I look forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thank you. It was lovely to talk to you. Good night.
Likewise. Ciao, ciao.